Okay, so for the last video, I just want to touch on communism and Marxism. Um, there was a lot, obviously, to take away from this. So I just wanted to touch on a few key things that really stood out to me and some experiences that I was able to kind of relate to that. So I like that you kind of clarified that the goal of communism is not to eliminate the right to private property, and that's a huge misconception. It is really interesting because I learned a little bit about communism when I was growing up, but I learned very little about it. And I've noticed that what I did learn about it, or what my preconceived ideas or these concepts were about communism and like these ideas around communism, were obviously very different than what I was able to learn from you through these lectures a little bit. So um, I always kind of thought that communism was like you can't own a business, the government literally takes all of your money, everybody makes the same, which that part of it is true, but there were just some interesting preconceived ideas that were just really off. So I found that very interesting. So in communism, or at least the truest form of communism, there is no state. And essentially, Marx argues that at the end of all of this, when all is said and done, as time, progresses, that eventually everyone will be communists anyway, and that the state will completely collapse. But there is that idea of the threat of foreign enemies coming in and being able to attack you. And so that portion of it wouldn't allow a true collapse of the state because it would leave you open to attack from those enemies. But eventually, the entire world would become communist. And he argued that it really is the truest form of government, the only form of government that doesn't attack itself and essentially self destruct and completely dismantle, right, the concept of that government or that state. So Marx said that we wouldn't really have to worry about that invasion because, in fact, during that time, until that time happened, we would have a state to some extent, right? So, a couple differences between socialism and communism. Socialism has those class distinctions. And I've actually had a lot of friends that have gone to Norway and Sweden, and they actually say that like the people there are so happy. And so it just kind of makes you wonder, like, are they happy because they're more socialist, or like have they just kind of created this way of life where they're just a little bit more open and accepting, and that leads to happiness? So there's like kind of a lot of things that go into play with some of these like socialist and communist ideas. Like, does that bring about happiness? Does that bring true equality and freedom? Is that the good life? And all of those things are very relative. So very interesting things to think about. But with socialism, essentially, you would have smaller gaps between the rich and the poor and the middle class, right? We would try to aim to kind of squeeze those out and make things a little bit more fair, just, and equal for everybody, again, with those opportunities. But I'd say the biggest difference I found between socialism and capitalism was your ability to make money, was your ability to profit, right? And so in socialism, profit still exists. You're still able to start businesses, you're able to make money, but the wealth and the way that it's distributed is a little bit more fair and takes more people into consideration. So the goal of that would be to eliminate those large gaps between the rich and the poor. And that's kind of the goal of socialism, is just to decrease those large gaps that make us a little bit more unequal. That's the way of true non-interference for us to have a true, free, equal, and access to the good life. Whereas communism essentially says that having profit is actually a bad thing. It's actually a really bad thing, and it's very negative. So in communism, there is no class distinction. There's no rich. There's no poor. Um, there really isn't the ability to make money, right? Because everybody's making the same amount of money. So Mark kind of talked about this idea of tyranny. I can never say that right. Tyranny. I think it's tyranny. But this idea that the theft of private property is like the biggest threat, right? And he says that communist is going to be the best way of life in order to prevent that theft, right? So he says that the I can never say that, bourgeoisie, the business class, the owners, the CEOs, the people who are at the top of the pyramid, right, are actually the greatest enemy of private property. And I thought that this was actually really interesting because I've had a lot of my friends lately um, trash, just to say it frankly, trash these people like Jeff Bezos and Steve Jobs. You know, when Steve Jobs was around, and Bill Gates, and these people who are at the top and who are making all this money, like the CEO of Disney, Bob Iger, which he's not the CEO anymore, but when he was, and how that this idea of they're actually stealing and taking away from the private property from the working class that they're employing. So to me, that was kind of a mind bender because as somebody again who owns my own business, I actually don't profit as much as people think that I do, and there is a lot of work involved, but I'm also creating a lot of opportunity for people who didn't know how to make money or didn't have a way to take care of themselves or didn't have a degree, didn't have a job, and I'm now giving them the opportunity to come work for my company to make a good living and make profit of their own and be able to reinvest that in whatever means in our society that they want, including themselves, or resources to buy a home or take care of their family or invest it in the stock market, whatever they want to do. So to me, the idea that I'm actually stealing from the people that work for me, I had kind of a difficult time with, not gonna lie. It was, don't know how I feel about that. But a couple of the logical problems. So he says that business owners do not do any form of labor, and all they do is own things, right? And that they shouldn't be paid more just for owning something. So essentially, our company's called the Living Group, and we're based out of LA. I live in Orange County now, but we're based out of LA. Our team's in LA. And essentially, that because I just thought of the idea and I just own the Living Group, that I shouldn't be compensated for owning that, even though it was my idea, my work, my money that I invested into it. I really just don't feel that that's accurate. And I know you don't want us to say, well, I just disagree with it because I disagree with it and it's not true, but um the form of taking from my employees, um I think about that in like a very real world sense. Like, what exactly do I take from my employees? Right. So I wanted to try to come up with a kind of counter argument where I was like, okay, maybe I take their time, or, I make them pay me a team lead fee, for giving them a lead. But then I was thinking, but I paid for the lead and I have to work in order to pay for the lead. And so if I pay for the lead, I feel like I'm kind of going down the rabbit hole, but it makes sense, I swear. If I pay for the lead that my work was directly dictant on, right? I can't pay for the lead because it's not free. So for me to work, to get paid the lead, to then give it to one of my associates to have the opportunity to make money off of that, and then I ask for a small amount of money in return for fronting that investment, to me is not a form of theft. To me, that's a form of opportunity and generating opportunity for somebody else. So that was one kind of flaw in the logic that I didn't per se agree with. Um, so ideally, though, so Marx says wealth was stolen from the workers, and all it was doing, it's meant for the wealthy, right? So it's meaningless. We're creating, capitalism creates these, you know, irrelevant and useless and, just whatever junk that we don't all need and they're not essential to live. And all that does is benefit people at the top. And then they use and abuse the people at the bottom. And I do think that there are companies where they do use and abuse their employees. But I'll be honest, I don't ever think that that's the mindset or the motivation for why people own businesses, is for the expense of labor or to be able to take from them in some way. Some people are just jerks and do that naturally. So I would say, for a counter argument of communism or Marxism, for me as a business owner, that's kind of the approach. That's where I'm coming from. So, again, another counter argument: no one is forced into sharing in communism. Truly sovereign, we are truly sovereign over our own private property. You can own your own things, but essentially everybody is going to make the same amount regardless of what you do. And obviously, the biggest argument against communism is, well, why would I go be I don't want to use your examples. I want to find my own. So, why would I go be a lawyer, or, like, help protect criminals? Or why would I be a police officer and go serve my community when I could just pick up trash and be a janitor? Why would I go and be of service to other people? And the communist argument says that you don't necessarily need the money or more pay to have a prestigious job, right? Because that's all relative. So people in different cultures and different societies value things differently, right? So it creates a lot of diversity that the Communist Party, or the communist idea, would say is very necessary and needed in a society, right? In a true free society. Um, you know, Lawyers, doctors, policemen, they help people, right? They're of service to others and they take pride in that. But you're willing to do it because you love it. And communism says not all people are lazy, and not all people would take advantage of the system, and take advantage of the fact that everyone gets paid the same. It also means that they wouldn't necessarily choose a shittier job for all intents and purposes just because they make the same amount of money. That some people are truly motivated by what they love to do. So those are some very interesting arguments, that I don't want to say arguments, but just some side thoughts of how I felt about communism, and what some of my takeaways were. I wanted to talk about the liberation of the Black community and Angela Davis's kind of idea on Black communism. One thing that I wrote down and really highlighted is, she talked a lot about liberating the people, and how, in order to really liberate the people, we need to get rid of the society and government strains that keep them captive, right? That keep them oppressed. And she talked a lot about unemployment, bad housing, things like that. And she actually saw it as a way for capitalism to exploit Black people, right? And she said that through that what it would take would be a true revolution of the Black community, of other minority groups that were leading and creating this movement to truly seize the wealth, take it back from these giant companies who are really just exploiting Black people and minorities in general, and to then give that money and those resources back to the hands of the people, and back to the hands of the Blacks and other racial and ethnic groups who have been oppressed and fallen victim to that capitalist system for so long. So she did say that she felt that this was a way to eradicate racism and classism, to remove that gap between the Black and the white, and the rich and the poor, because the two, she argued, and probably rightfully so, tend to go very hand in hand. And she said that classism was the complete exploitation, that a boss can divide the Black workers from the white workers. So, some of my takeaways from this, I know I just kind of like summarized it, but me talking it through, there are definitely ways that I think economically we can accommodate and try to eliminate all possibilities. A good example is affirmative action. But I feel that taking away, and I guess this was like my biggest counter argument for her, taking away from larger companies who, again, have worked, put their life savings into this, whatever, that would be under the pretense that every major CEO, businessman, businesswoman, and large company were 100% dominated by what that all the CEOs and all the businessmen were white. And there's actually a lot of, maybe not like a lot of, by, like in relative means comparatively to white people. Yeah, it's predominantly white when it comes to business owners and CEOs, but there are Black men, Black women, and other ethnic minority groups that are in these positions of power. So an argument to that would be you're not just taking power away from white people to try to and stripping them of their capitalist potential and their capitalist agenda, and stripping them of that and then giving it to people who've been oppressed. I'm not against giving things to people who are oppressed and giving them that equal fair opportunity to work and make money and contribute to society. I think all those things are very important, but you would also be stripping it away from those black owners as well, those black business owners and those black CEOs and the Latino uh and Asian communities who own. And I know personally people who are very wealthy out here who most giant corporate real estate companies out here are predominantly Asian. And so for her to argue that that is the best way, that is how you achieve that racial justice, and you eliminate that oppression, and you get down to the bare bones, the brass tacks of all this, right, to eliminate it where it hurts everyone the most, and that's with their money. So take it from the rich white man. But the problem with that is you're not just taking from the rich white man, you could also be taking from a rich African American woman too. So I thought she brought up a lot of interesting points. Obviously the video is like quite dated. I think we can obviously do more as a society. We need to do more. We have a lot of work to do. But I think if people are able, like that veil of ignorance, I think is a really key life principle, not just a political principle. If we're able to say, I value people of color, I value people who are in the working class, I value, and as a business owner, I do. And I'm not perfect by any means, but I think if more people took that approach, I don't think that communism is the answer. I think people are the answer. And I know that that's kind of like a lame, generic, like watered down reason. But I honestly think that if you're stripping capitalism purely on that basis, saying it's capitalism's fault or it's a major reason, while some people may agree with that to some extent, and that capitalism does play an influence in business and business politics and how wealth is distributed, it's not fair to say it's capitalism's fault. And if you take the capitalism away, that racism will go away, because you're also stripping Black people and ethnic people of their business as well. So I found that very interesting. I don't know what you think about that. I kind of tried to put a little bit more meat on the bones, and hopefully I articulated it okay. But those were some of my takeaways, and I'll see you next week.